Sorry, I was supposed to remind you of that, wasn't I?
No, that's fine. Yeah, I got a mental message from you, so everything's fine.
You
All
in
right.
New York, Tom?
Yeah, my office is in New York, but I'm actually out of
Yeah.
my home in Connecticut today.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll get things started. Welcome everybody to our spring seminar. This is our third day of 4 pieces of the puzzle. Let's see. We are very glad to have Tom Preece with us. It's going to be a great presentation. Don't forget about the gift cards. You show up, you find out your piece of the puzzle, and you are entered to win one of 3 $50 gift cards. Of course, board members aren't eligible for this, so it's just down to our other members and guests. And we'd like to thank our sponsors for helping us with this. We have Active Navigation, Bayshore Records Management, and GRM Document Management. We'd like to thank them very much. And today, we have Tom Preece, the people problem, why employees are the biggest obstacle in good records management, and what to do about it, which is the most important thing, what to do about it. I think I've said enough here, and I can stop the share, and I'll turn it over to Tom. But if you have questions, just send them directly to me in chat, and I will direct them to Tom at the end of his presentation. So, Tom, right now, I'm going to stop the share, and you can take over.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Hutch. And I think you should now be able to see my screen. Great. All right. My name is Tom Preece, as you just heard. I am the Director of Information Governance Solutions at Rational Enterprise. So we provide technology and services for information governance, as well as e-discovery, but I head up the group responsible for the development of and the delivery of the information governance technology, along with how to sort of package it with services to provide a complete solution. So a lot of today's presentation is from what we've seen get traction and work with various clients in different sort of projects. And what I'm going to be talking about today, right, is the people problem, as they just said. So how people can sometimes be the biggest block to successful records management. Now, I also want to talk right at the top here about this little guy, the puzzle that is being put together over the course of the week, which I'm super excited to be part of. I'm happy to let everyone know that today's presentation represents the red piece. So you can cross that off your list. And if that is literally the only reason you showed up, you can log off. But hopefully that's not the only reason. Hopefully you do want to stick around for a bit of the content. Don't log off. Yeah, so the content is organized first into sort of the intro. So we'll talk a little bit more about the problem, how I'm defining it, and then we'll split it up into some broad categories. So the political, the cultural obstacles, and also the psychological obstacles. And all of those we're going to talk about sort of tools, techniques, models, and sort of goals, right? Of like, what do you want out of this for dealing with each? And then finally, we'll have a summary period. And then after that, we'll have some dedicated sort of Q&A time, as Hutch mentioned. If you have any questions, please enter it into the chat, and we'll have some time to deal with that at the very end. So as I mentioned, the information from today is compiled from various clients. So don't get the impression that one organization sort of implemented everything we're going to go over. And in the same way, you should not conceive of trying to tackle all of these areas in depth, at least not at the same time. I'd really encourage everyone to see if any of them just speak to an unmet need or strategy you'd like to try, and to consider it sort of an open book or an open toolbox, right, for you to pick and choose from. So with that in mind, we'll talk a little bit more about the problem. So before you actually get into the people problem in records management, right, there's already a lot of work to do. There's the record schedule, right? Understanding all the regulatory landscape that your organization sits in, as well as sort of the legal and business objectives and how they translate into all of that. It can take a lot of work not to just research that in the first place, but to keep it up to date, right? As your business changes, moves into new jurisdictions, and even if your business stays completely the same, the laws and the regulations will change around you, right? So there's a ton of work there, but that challenge is at least well framed, right? It's very clear what needs to be done. It's just hard and takes a lot of work. Once the schedule is in place, one of the biggest blocks to actually implementing it are the employees themselves, right, that make up the organization. The same people who are constantly creating the records, sometimes inadvertently, are often looking at managing those records as a burden, right? And at the best of times, we generally see that they're neglecting it. At the worst of times, they're sort of outright sabotaging it. But why, right? And what can we do about it? It's so much more unclear, this problem, so much softer of a problem. And that people problem is the key question of today's presentation. So as I mentioned, to organize the discussion, I've sorted the problems and some possible strategies into sort of main categories. So you have the political. So what we're talking about here is really strategies that are centered around the hierarchy of an organization, right? How do you get top level buy-in from your leaders? How do you get horizontal peers in line for a coalition? And also, how does that translate to a buy-in strategy for just the average employee? And then the cultural. So this draws heavily from the concept of the information culture of an organization and the information culture framework, or the ICF. This is created by Gillian Oliver and Fiorella Foscarini. Essentially, the ICF organizes aspects of people's relationship to information into categories that are either really ingrained, right, really hard to change, and then other ones that are much easier, much more malleable. And then they advocate for, of course, strategizing accordingly, right? So adapt to things that you cannot change and add more resources into the things that you can. And the final one is the psychological. So this really focuses on the motivation of people, right? And how you can try and plan and design for this factor when you're implementing anything from sort of records category organization on your schedule to training to anything else. So jumping straight into that first one of the political, right? This is really about navigating the groups and the power structure associated with those groups in the organization to affect the change you want, whatever it is, right? So whatever you're looking for and working on your current priorities. So this takes a broader approach than, for instance, just focusing on the messaging you want to bring to the executive group of your organization, right? Messaging is important, but it should be politically savvy in that it speaks to the importance of records management in the context of your organization and the other things considered to be a priority at the time. But even before you approach the board or the C-suite or whatever sort of that executive function is that exists in your organization, there's a lot of groundwork you can do to sort of maximize your chances of success and really uncover what those priorities are and align your arguments with that. So that groundwork is really well captured, I think, in the first 3 steps of John Cotter's framework, which is the 8 steps for leading change. You may have heard this before. So this is a framework that's developed by Cotter and refined basically over his entire 30+ year career. It's recognized internationally by many as being a really powerful tool in affecting long-term change in an organization. It's really designed to be used by the leader of an organization, but anyone can use the model to sort of understand how they can affect change. And in particular, the first 3 steps. So create a sense of urgency, build a guiding coalition, and also form a strategic vision. So I'll spend a little bit of time expanding on these and talking about how they apply in a records management context, right? So create a sense of urgency. So overcoming inertia, right, of the status quo usually takes a little bit more than just good points or like good arguments. Urgency is the picture or the backdrop that convinces people change is more important than complacency. That it's something truly at stake here if you don't take action. So something to convince people that what has always worked will not work, or at least there's a new way that'll be far better. So when records management deals in 12-year retention periods or 50-year retention periods, the urgency can often be lost in normal conversations, I think. So some tactics for this step included, also outlined by Cotter, is bring the outside in, right? So this is all about getting outside information from the organization and empirical data about sort of the worst that's happened to others that did not adopt the change you're advocating for, and really linking it to your organization, really making it feel real, like it could happen to your organization tomorrow. So for example, often the importance of records management is sort of communicated through the cost of over retention, right? In the context of data breaches, litigation. So in other words, for the more records you you have exposed to these events, the higher the cost is proportionately, right? So every record that was kept that didn't need to be, the event is costing proportionally more than it should. But this argument often doesn't take it to the final step, doesn't take it all the way to really hit home that this could actually happen to your organization. And this is particularly important if nothing like it has ever happened before to your organization, right? So for instance, you can try and paint a picture using real data about your systems. Is there, for instance, is there an estimate of how much content is in fact overpreserved? You can also look if there are any sort of industry peers. So someone in the same industry around the same size where something like that has happened to them recently. And also then take the two together, right? Could you put a number on how much this would cost your organization with the current sort of rate of the estimate of over retention? And if you don't have any estimate at all, but if you want to go a little bit deeper in that, you can go as far as sort of doing an audit or a spot check of a system that has sort of relatively low permissions, like a shared drive that everyone has access to in your organization. So go on there and pretend like you are a hacker, right? Who just gained access to that repository. What would you be looking for? And can you easily find it? Did it need to be there in the first place, right? If you use real examples of what you find during that exercise, personal data that should have been deleted a long time ago, when you bring that to management, it makes the story much more vivid and concrete and sort of helps instill the sense of urgency. And to be clear, no one has the time to do this for all your information repositories, right? This is not like a comprehensive audit. The point is just to get enough to tell a story, right? To create a narrative that makes the scenario feel more applicable and sort of more immediate. So information about regulatory actions on industry peers is also usually publicly available if you're a regulated industry. So in most cases, that could be a really good thing to bring internally. So the next tactic is behave with urgency every day. So when you yourself treat the implementation of the retention schedule as an urgent matter, you will begin to instill it into others you interact with, along with sort of the policies and systems that you interact with. Now, when people hear act with urgency every day, they imagine themselves running everywhere and yelling at everyone, working 10-hour days and simply not taking breaks, right? But not only is that not sustainable, but it's also not true to the spirit of what this tactic is actually about. It's much more about fostering proactive attitude, a flexible working style, right? And truly being solutions oriented. And a good way to think about this is if you are in a crisis, think of the way that you must act, right? You don't have the convenience of having all the information or the plan completely set before you act. So to compensate, you're always iterating, right? You try to actively identify new ways of getting yourself sort of out of the crisis. And when something's not working, you adapt quickly, right? You pivot, working towards that singular goal of the solution, which is simply getting out of the crisis. But it's that quality that you want to embody every day that you want to adopt. So set a long-term goal and make sure that everything you are doing is working towards that goal and not let perfect be the enemy of progress, right? Making incremental improvements wherever possible and show a willingness to adopt and be flexible to even to accommodate others as long as you're still working towards that goal. And sort of the third tactic for creating a sense of urgency is to find the opportunity in crisis. And I think this one's a little bit more self-explanatory, right? People have heard about this before. Depending on the crisis, this may actually be the first tactic doing its work for you. So the outside coming in, like if there is a cybersecurity breach or there's a major litigation, right? The organization is now viscerally feeling the effects of poor records management, and you can capitalize on that, right? Don't let that pass by. Document what is the impact, right? What can we do now to make it better for next time? And that actually might be a great time to capture any revenue spend on sort of technology solutions or services that are sort of aimed at the short-term problem. See if you can stretch it out to make sure they also provide value in the long term. Is there anything residual, any work product you can reuse out of that? Because often a lot of classification and sort of like investigation goes into the content at that point. So even if it wasn't some crisis that deals directly with records like that, such as like a huge reduction in headcount due to low profits, don't shrink away thinking there's no money, right? Low profits can't get a new initiative. Instead, think that all those people who just walked out the door, they're gone, but their data is still here, right? If we don't do something about categorizing it quickly, then we're going to lose any hope of leveraging any sort of institutional memory about what it is, why they created it, where does it fit in. So the second sort of step of Cotter's model, beyond the creating a sense of urgency, is build a guiding coalition. So this idea is really recognizing that sort of top-down support is essential, right? It's super critical. But once that is in place, basically anyone in the organization can sabotage the change from happening, right? It's the people themselves that need to institute and sort of maintain the change. So in Cotter's model, this guiding coalition is a group of people that are generally leaders, right? They have some kind of power and credibility. They also have expertise that's specific to the change, so skills. And now you won't likely be in the position to explicitly pick this group at this stage, but what you can do in advance of requesting sort of top-down support is building an alliance of people that represent different departments and gain their buy-in for the change that you want. And that way, when you go to the executive group, it's not just you and your perspective, right? But you have the buy-in of multiple stakeholders in the organization. You essentially have formed an alliance that makes your request bear much more weight. So if you're well organized in this, the leadership may then at that point appoint, appreciate your work, appoint the coalition you already started to define and make it official. So what might this look like, right? At the heart, everyone in an organization needs something from your records and your information. This alliance building has a lot less to do with sort of a media campaign for why records management is important, and has a lot more to do with listening, right? With understanding the issues and the unmet needs that others have with the information that they're dealing with. The most obvious sort of obvious groups that you'll find alliances are other governance functions, right? Like legal and compliance, if that's not where your function already sits, but then information security, information technology, risk management, right? Privacy. But beyond that, the actual managers in business units, right? Engineering, practice management, sales enablement, marketing, all of them have their own wants from information. And there's a good chance that someone, in at least some of these functions, is thinking about how they can get more out of information. Or actually what keeps them up at night, right? What worries them about it? So listening to these stakeholders gives you a ton of information on what better records management could deliver to your organization, right? They won't speak about it in those terms, but you'll be able to translate, if there was better governance, which ones can we solve and which ones can't we, right? Like there's going to be limits to it. So really identify that. So you take the things that you can help with, consolidate that intelligence, and that is what's going to be used in your own messaging when you seek the support of leadership. So you get to present it something as the whole organization is asking for, even though they're not asking for it. They don't know that they're asking for it, right? Once you're able to make progress as well in the program, you can go back to those same people and continue that relationship, right? Say, I'm making progress. Do you want to help me and get behind me? And officially sort of enlist their help to implement better classification and retention. And you can do so with this personalized message of how RIM can help them and their own goal specifically. So again, RIM can't solve every information challenge, even though sometimes we like to think that it would. So don't try and overpromise here. Really be, specific. But a big part of the coalition building is also not just seeking allies, but also identifying the naysayers, right? People who are detractors from the implementation of the program that you want to have you put in place. So these people cannot be ignored, right? In fact, you need to look at them as assets. You'll have many people that are detractors, but the problem is they're usually invisible and silent. So if you find a naysayer who's actually willing to speak up, you can be sure that they're representing many, many more people that are like-minded that you're not hearing from directly. So having the naysayer engaged in dialogue allows you to apply empathy, right? To understand their world and their perspective. And that is pure ammunition for figuring out how to adopt your strategies to include them. But also just practically speaking, like projects are always much more successful if you fully understand the wants and the objections of all stakeholders from the very outset, right? An objection thrown while you're trying to sort of scale up an established strategy is much harder and much more costly to overcome than an objection identified during sort of the early strategy planning. And so the step, or the third step that final one we're going to talk about today, is form a strategic vision. And so when we say strategic vision, it's related to the strategy of the change itself, right? How you'll implement the change and why. But it's different. It's really about the future state. After all the work is done, what will it look like? And sometimes that sounds like the easiest step, but the key here is that it has to be strategic. Namely, you have to balance the need for it to be appealing to your stakeholders, while on the other hand, it has to be sensible and believable, right? People will often focus too much on the appeal of the future state, and that's how you get sort of moonshot visions, right? That if we just followed the retention schedule to a T and classify absolutely everything, then we could all start doing big data analytics and our revenue is just going to go through the roof. And this sounds amazing, right? But it actually erodes ground support because you lose credibility with people that otherwise would have been proponents or at least neutral, right? And you're giving naysayers ammunition against you. So the vision needs to be tied to your understanding of the problem and needs to consider the resources that you're likely to get access to. So likewise, going too far in the direction of sensibility and credibility will actually start to lose appeal with people. When you're trying to inspire action and you suddenly find yourself reciting metrics and like the actual project plan that you've put together to get to the future state, then people will get bogged down, right, in the details or the technicalities. They might get bored. And you'll actually have lost the sort of emotional connection that's important for the appeal to click. So a good way to sort of make the vision more consumable is to tweak it depending on the stakeholder you're talking to. And this should be informed by the alliance building that you should have done, right? Where you have already done some work to uncover the different pain points of different potential allies and how your vision will create a great future state for them specifically. So once you've done as much work as you can in the first 3 steps of the change process, it's likely as far as you can get without getting that sort of top level buy-in and support. Seeking the support of leadership is essential, right, for real change to happen. In our experience, real change in the realms of sort of compliance and governance has to come from the top down. So what exactly are you asking for, right? Budget, of course. Everyone always wants more budget, but ongoing support is sort of just as important as that initial buy-in, namely positive reinforcement in leading by example. So having a main sponsor or champion in the executive group would be ideal, but some examples of sort of concrete support items to get from leadership might be a system of rewarding groups, right? Who are complying with your program well, or at least an acknowledgement of those groups. So without that operational form of support from leadership, an initiative hardly ever makes it to the top of most people's to-do lists, right? If it's not important to the leadership, or it's not visibly important, it has a big impact. And leadership should also commit to sort of visibly review the status of record schedule compliance, right? Ask questions, place actions to sort of push progress forward. So helping secure these items would be done through this aforementioned groundwork, right? Bring to bear, possibly in a single meeting, the most effective messaging you've gathered around sort of create that sense of urgency amongst them, outlining the work you've done to get alignment and stakeholder consultation in the rest of the enterprise, then outline what that appealing future state would be to work towards. So once the leadership is sold on the need for change, right, then you have a realistic shot at actual implementation of a program. And you could seriously move the needle in terms of compliance. The final steps of Cotter's model, I won't really go into today, but they include sell the change to a broad base. So this enlists a volunteer army, sort of remove barriers to innovation and the quick generation of impact, right? And then generate short-term wins, which you then consolidate and turn those short-term wins into sort of a sustained acceleration. And then you institute the change, right, to make it anchored within the organization. So if you have any interest in learning more about the model, you can go to cotterinc.com. It's Cotter Institute. They've got some great resources, and there's lots of resources out in the internet in general about Cotter's model. But now I'm actually going to switch gears to talk about something I think is a little bit more useful for navigating the cultural obstacles of your particular organization. And I mentioned it's really looking at the ICF, or the Information Cultural Framework, which was created by Gillian Oliver and Fiorella Foscarini. So they designed the ICF as a sort of pragmatic method to evaluate the unique ways your organization creates and consumes information for the explicit purpose of sort of driving the adoption of a records management program. So essentially, they argue that robust implementation models like ISO 15489 go into great detail on sort of implementing the records program, all the way from sort of requirements gathering to policy creation to control and procedure setting. But it fails to take into account a huge factor, which is the culture around information, right? The people that you're going to interact with and get help with. It's sort of like drawing a map from one location to another without taking into account any mountains or rivers that might be in the way, or even sort of offer faster paths right to your destination. So their work's really informed by a lot of studies, a lot of previous work in the area. They've concluded that certain cultural factors are much harder to change or to influence. So that even though a certain records management process may be correct from the perspective of records keeping requirements, it will ultimately fail when implemented in a certain way in a cultural context. So records managers should evaluate their information culture first and implement their culture, but implement the program by adapting to factors they cannot change, right? While at the same time assigning resources to cultural factors that are more changeable and are in line with needs. So to be clear, our concept of national or ethnic culture play a role, but they really define information culture as being its own thing. Every organization just has an inherent information culture, and it's made up of a lot of different factors. So here is the ICF visual, right? The bottom layer being the most ingrained aspects of information culture and the hardest to change. And the middle being a little bit more, malleable, but sort of still ingrained somewhat. And then the top being the most changeable. So the ICF has a huge focus on sort of this upfront investigation and research to then really cater to the culture on the back end. So, and change the things you can change, which may seem intuitive at first, right? But when you see sort of value accorded to records at the bottom of the pyramid, many records managers would be sort of taken aback since they've spent considerable resources trying to educate their organization on exactly this subject, right? And evaluations at the end of the training might even indicate that training was really impactful. It becomes more clear when you understand that the sort of consideration here is whether or not you'll be able to holistically make a change that's sustained over time, right? That becomes instituted, becomes newly ingrained in the information culture of the organization going forward. In other words, these sort of successful bursts of education have a real vulnerability of becoming a fad. They rarely get internalized, right? And this is sort of further complicated when acknowledging that the value accorded to records attribute, like a lot of the ICF attributes, is not going to be ubiquitous across the organization, right? It's influenced by a lot of factors from, yes, national culture, or factors that sort of transcend national culture, like ethnicities, religions, linguistic factors, but also occupational culture, right? The tasks that a salesperson, for instance, finds important versus the tasks that like a finance person finds important in their day-to-day has a lot of really powerful influence over the value that they accord to records. So with all these factors at play, right, even small organizations should expect like a pretty wide variety in the attitudes across all the ICF attributes. And I'm not going to get into all of them today, but I will drill into a few of them and mainly focus on value core to records to sort of demonstrate how to use that model. So with value according to records, one thing I want to underline about that aspect is that they really make it explicit that it's talking about the respect for records as evidence is what they're talking about. It's really core to what they mean, which is a very strong RIM perspective, right? It's different than the value, like the monetary value according to information or sort of the idea of information assets. So when it comes to evaluating or sort of investigating the value according to records, the approach branches into sort of three main areas. One, you can say, if I want to find this out for my organization, let's evaluate sort of indirectly just through the RIM infrastructure, right? What's kind of infrastructure that exists in my organization to support this? You can then do it more directly through people, right? Their attitudes and behaviors, and then also sort of mix when evaluating sort of system usage, specifically like document management systems or something like that. So first, I'm going to go into examples of things to evaluate around sort of RIM infrastructure. And before I do that, it's worth sort of a preface that if you've been at your organization for a very long time, a lot of this part is going to be obvious, right? Just sort of already observed a lot of it. If you're newer, there's going to be more investigation is going to be required. But the first sort of area to look at is the employment of specialist staff, maybe, such as yourself. So are people who are really focused on records and information management that's in proportion to the size and the complexity of your organization. Right, so you have different jurisdictions, if you got multiple different functions, different business lines that are supposed to be separate from each other or something like that. And many will interpret this as finding out how understaffed you are. Right, no one ever thinks that they're like perfectly well staffed, but it's a really good indication as to how recognized is this in terms of the resource spend. There's also the existence of sort of organization-wide RIM policies and procedures, right? And the controls to sort of implement it. So are they organization wide, or is it really just like that's a finance and HR thing that doesn't actually apply to most of our information? And also, are there systems that exist to manage both paper and digital, right? Or is it still just a paper thing? If it is digital, which realms? Is it like we don't think of email as records yet, or something like that, God forbid? That's a really good area to look at that spectrum. And then also the extent to, that record keeping functionality is embedded in other business information systems, right? Is it just the sort of the document management system and everybody thinks that that's where we need records functionality, or is there anything embedded and considered in procurement and stuff like that? So the next area that I mentioned is to look at evaluate the attitudes and behaviors. So is something as simple as the usage, right? Are people logging in and actually using the official sort of record, like systems of authority when it comes to records? Is there a preparedness to sort of buy in to the policies and procedures? What are people's attitudes towards these things? The readiness to sort of set up personal systems to sort of circumvent official systems. So people are keeping things on their personal desktop, laptop, set up their own share. Maybe they go into a SaaS Dropbox type repository. It's often a reflection that they think that the sort of organization systems are just for compliance purposes only, right? It's not really something that we need to use for our core job. And then also sort of the willingness to participate in
Are you okay, Tom? Did we lose your sound?
There we go. I'm back. I'm sorry. I just had my microphone got sick of me talking and just decided to give up. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you.
Yeah, we
Um,
can hear you now. I thought I had done something.
Nope, it was my technology failure. All right. So then the willingness to participate in training, right? Is it seen as a welcome interruption to their day, or is it a burden, right? Is this something that people loathe to do? Now that third one I mentioned before, IT usage, it's mainly concerned with the proper usage of sort of document management systems. And a really good example of that, a lot of people have run into, is the sort of the values that are put into required fields, especially if there's like a drop down option. People are shocked that every project they're working on has to do with avocados, or it all takes place in Albania, even though you've got like a really small office in Albania, because it's the A, right? It's the thing that's the top of the list. And so those sort of overrides to required fields is a really strong indicator whether or not there is a value accorded to this as evidence, right? That people are taking this seriously. So actual assessment techniques for these different areas, right, can range from sort of low to high resource spend, the lowest being desk work, they classify it as, right? So, so the desk research looking at document analysis, right? Literal observation of infrastructure, like what is out there. And then a little bit up from that is actual surveys, right? Being able to do online or paper surveys even to be able to ask people questions directly. But usually that's going to be a more sort of quantitative. And then the highest level of resource spend is interviews, right? Actual long form sort of interviews, interactions with people. Now, the goal of the assessment, right, is not to pin down individuals who are problematic, but to get a picture of this factor across your organization. So it's likely that there is going to be very strong variation. If that's the case, can you associate that with particular work units or locations? And if you're really engaging with the ICF, you might find alignments with the other level 1 factors, such as information preferences, right? Language considerations or regional technical infrastructure. But once you have this information, sort of the overall conclusion is that more traditional methods of training and policy application, in other words, you must do this, employee, because I said so, it's the law, will be most successful in areas that have high value according to records, but in areas where there's low value according to records, not only will the approach not work, but it may actually be doing more harm than good, right? You may drive people away from official systems and actually erode their trust or sort of willingness to work with the record keeping function. And in fact, that is a factor in the third layer of the ICF, the trust of records and information management. So you do have control over that. So what do you do, right? The bottom line is you need to be creative and open about applying policy with this group. Do not try and change the low value that they accord to records, but instead try to accommodate it and make it more accessible by maybe even changing the records categories themselves. One approach is to sort of really try and understand the social context of a record, of its creation, of its use, as an important factor in categorization, instead of strictly the sort of content of the record as it relates to regulations and stuff like that. The social context will sometimes have key information on how you can better drive the adoption of retention and classification in certain areas. I'll give you an example. So say that an HR group is found to be hoarding resumes, right, of past candidates, even though they're supposed to be placed in a particular SharePoint site and filed with metadata that facilitates sort of automatic deletion after a few years, right? If the candidate was not hired, keep the resume for a certain period of time, and then gets automatically deleted. So you might find that this is not just a one-off thing, right? But it's rather systematic of them. Traditionally, it's categorically non-compliance, right? It's against policy. And in fact, it's dangerous if the candidates are living in a jurisdiction with sort of robust privacy laws, right? Such as GDPR. So it may seem confusing, even that sort of a function that's so otherwise linked to compliance, such as HR, are circumventing the sort of official process in the system. Now, if you begin to sort of take into account some possible social factors, it may paint a more complete picture about what's going on. It may be that the HR group provides a well-known function to the business managers of recycling resumes for new positions, right? The HR group's occupational culture in your organization may have experienced repeated situations where different managers return to them for retrieval of past resumes, and the HR managers go to the system and they can't find them in the sort of system of official record. So they lost patience, and then the business managers lost patience with them. So it's reflecting on them. Now, the system may be optimized, for instance, auto deletion a little bit too much and not so much for retrieval of these records. So now the HR group has a lack of trust in the system, and they've learned that socially, to increase their credibility, they should just manage these records on their own. Not classify them according to, for instance, jurisdiction and year of application of the candidates, would be useful for compliance purposes, but for function, right, and salary range. So maybe their homegrown sort of approach not only has cured their issue of sort of poor credibility, but it's actually swung the pendulum in the other direction, right, making them a go-to resource for business managers. And in fact, this credibility has made the business managers more responsive when the HR managers need their help with implementing things like sexual harassment training and stuff like that. So now the management of this document type already has really strong power connotations, which is a force that explained that, one, the HR group does have, in fact, a decent value according to records, but their incentives to treat this document type as a personal record instead of sort of a business record is simply stronger than their incentive to sort of comply with official processes. And sort of due to past experience too, their trust in record keeping systems and their sort of IT has eroded to the point where they perceive themselves as being better custodians for the record than records management. So overcoming all of those forces through training alone and on the importance of good record keeping will simply not solve the problem, right? Instead, the approach needs to be different for the HR group and likely creative. You may want to find a way for them to keep this document type separate from the rest and try to instead empower them to take charge of retention. The message is that if you want to make any real and lasting progress in moving the needle on records retention, you'll need to go to them and try a new approach. So you likely will not have the resources to do that sort of social context analysis, which is something that's drawn from something called genre studies. You can't do it for every records category, certainly not every document type. The exact example that I just gave is synthetic, but it draws from a lot of specifics we've seen in different clients in real life. So that's why assessing the value according to records is first designed to be a broad stroke activity, right? To get a wide picture across your organization and then determine the areas where additional resources should be spent to get more information. And so to link that back to those assessment approaches, desk work on examining RIM infrastructure, information and documents and stuff like that is much less resource intensive, right? And much more broader stroke. So when you go into the more resource intensive, but still sort of scalable thing of surveys, which should always be anonymous surveys, you can make it a little bit more targeted based on what you've learned so far. So for instance, you could say, have people strongly agree or disagree on a spectrum, right? We've all done that before, on statements such as records management is an essential part of my work. Agree or disagree. Records management is everyone's responsibility. Agree or disagree. Records management requirements are a barrier to working efficiently. Agree or disagree? Anonymous survey. Remember, I like all my work-related emails to be filed in the archive solution. I like it, right? Agree or disagree? So that gives you a lot of insight into people's attitudes about what's actually going on. The most resource-intensive form of assessment is the live interviews. So the same sort of questions can be asked, but in an open-ended way to sort of upend more information about the why. Like, could you describe ways that records management requirements benefit the work you do and other areas where they limit the work you do? So the scale of high load resource spend techniques should be applied more selectively as you sort of zoom in on areas where you think there's a problem that you may need to adapt to. By the way, if you're wondering which avenues to sort of deliver these assessments, right? In other words, in-person versus digital, group versus individual. And if you're doing a group, should it be a vertical work group with people of different seniorities, or should it be a horizontal across functions that are equal in seniority? The other aspects of the first layer of the ICF give really a ton of insights into how to do this, in particular information preferences. So one of the most interesting parts of information preferences is this concept of power distance. So power distance is a concept of explaining how accepted a vertical hierarchy is in an organization, right? Essentially, it's to the extent which official power hierarchies are respected by everyone throughout the hierarchy. People, in high power are very comfortable with their position, equally as comfortable are the people in low power. That's a very high power distance score organization. Organizations where vertical hierarchies apply in job title alone, right? They have very low power distance score. So surveys, trainings, any potential group activity done in a vertical business group with folks of all different sort of seniorities in the same room, it's likely doomed to failure in a high power distance organization, whereas low power distance organizations will actually thrive in such an arrangement. So figuring out the sort of information preferences of your organization can be really beneficial for assessing the other ICF factors, and also how to implement creative solutions, right? What the preferences are. Other information preference examples topics include sort of synchronous versus asynchronous communications, visual versus written text, and also information sharing versus hoarding, and some others. But back to the techniques for finding sort of a new way to work with groups, for instance, with low value according to records. So non-traditional approaches like gamification sometimes has a really positive effect. So for anyone with sort of unfamiliar with it, gamification is taking a system that is otherwise regarded as tedious and finding a way to create feedback loops, right? Usually accomplished through something like earning points, getting rewards, earning recognition through successfully competing on things like leaderboards to make it more fun, right? Groups who have a high value according to records might dislike an approach trying to make records management fun, but it can be much more successful with those who have a low value according to records in the first place. And another technique to think about is automation, right? The measurement of the value according to records in your organization can be a really great tool or lens in understanding where and why to apply automation. So namely, some people will find automation of sort of life cycle actions like deletion, right, to be truly disturbing. And in fact, they can cause them to sort of lose trust in systems and become more futile, right? Where others see it as a huge relief and sort of a really welcome balm to the burden that they see records management being on them. So automation might already exist, right, in different forms as part of a document management system or some other system. There's other technology like the ones that we provide that actually brings records management automation to other systems like in place and file shares and desktops and email systems, Dropbox-like repositories. And that's a really effective way to sort of meet users where they are, right? Where they want to be, where they're already working, sort of take them into account and to move the authority of records management into systems that they actually prefer instead of forcing another information system or silo on them. And that's actually a really good segue into the sort of final part of the presentation, which is considering the psychological barriers and elements. So the first one I want to talk about is the feeling that many get of being sort of overwhelmed when confronted with some sort of additional responsibility. Records management often falls into this camp, right? It's often seen as an add-on to their day job. It's not necessarily seen as a burden, but just because they're pressed for time already, right? It simply never makes it to the top of their to-do list. And part of that too is you could just seem dull and administrative, right? There's just nothing aligning with their interest to choose it ahead of other tasks. It's on their priority list, right? It's just not important enough, not attractive enough to make it to the part of the priority list that actually gets done. So this is distinctly different than choosing non-compliance, right? And that should be treated differently. So one way to sort of combat that is the messaging that they get, either through formal training, if you choose to institute formal training, or through other means like documentation or bulletins. Most basic in this communication is the why, right? If you're only able to communicate in one place, either the how or the why of compliance, like you only had so many characters or something, it'd be much more preferable to explain the why. Because if the why is properly communicated, then they will seek out the how. But if they thoroughly understand the how, conversely, there's not much pushing them to seek out the why, right? They make up their own why, usually out of impressions. And that means you really are leaving it up to chance whether they prioritize it. So specificity in the why is also a great tool to amp it up, right? Why is this important, not just to the organization, but to that person specifically in their role in this moment of time? And a good access to think about there is a sort of importance versus benefits approach, make sure that both are covered. So importance speaks to the desire to do the right thing, or benefits speak to the desire to improve, or sort of like their self motivation. So employees need to understand, why is it important both to the company, but also especially to them, right? What's in it for me? So often they don't see the correlation between what they create and the bigger picture, especially in compliance, right? Often to them, they're just doing a task that happens to create an output. They don't understand the wider importance of that output. So stress the benefits of what they get out of this, either directly or through the organization if the organization was well governed. Another good access to think about in this or anywhere in compliance really is rewards versus consequences. So it'll always be more positive for people to be motivated by a reward for compliance or showing good participation in a records program, whether it be something as soft as recognition, right? Or something as simple and tangible as sort of a gift card, a reward, There's a very direct way to positively motivate people. Too often companies have a plan to sanction non-compliance, but miss an opportunity to incentivize good compliance with some sort of reward. However, rewards alone, right, will not drive compliance for all folks. The complementary strategy of consequences is also very important, right? To do so, though, you need to establish clear responsibilities and accountabilities that everybody holds, every employee holds at the outset, right? And if they're found to be out of compliance, then to have really clear consequences that are consistently applied to different people. And that consistency is super important to avoid feeling of discrimination. It has to be applied to the analyst as well as the director, right? It's also important to make it really clear ahead of time what will happen, what the consequences are, so that when someone finds themselves facing it, it doesn't come as a surprise, right? They already knew it was coming and they just need to bite the bullet. And this is also a great place to get creative, right? For instance, if people are failing to archive their email properly, maybe they're sentenced to spending a whole day cleaning up their department share, right? A sort of penile labor that can still be productive. Now, obviously, this is where support from leadership is really important, right? Otherwise, you won't realistically be able to institute any rewards or consequences of any real substance. So another area that will have positive impacts for overcoming psychological obstacles is simplification and standardization, right? Making the record schedule as easy to understand as possible is sort of a basic step in making it more accessible to folks, both as a general concept, right? Like what is a record schedule, as well as when they need to interact with it and to understand it, what they have and how to declare it. So there's a lot out there on how to transform your schedule into like a big bucket approach, which is great, but there's also worth paying attention to the language being used, right? Make sure the language is not alienating anyone with too much sort of RIM jargon. Try to give document type examples if possible if you haven't already done that. At the same time, though, if you're choosing language that is less sort of technical or less jargony, make sure you're still consistent in it, or else you'll end up blurring things more than clarifying them. So for instance, if you're changing records categories and record series into something more generic, like high level categories, detailed categories, stick with those new terms consistently and don't start talking about subcategories. And this is sort of the perfect area to solicit direct feedback too from people, whether you're updating an existing schedule, establishing a brand new schedule, or you just have the same schedule, you've had it for years. Understanding what people think about it, right? How they feel about it in their own words. This helps a lot with seeing it through a user's eyes, and it's sort of the first step in something called design thinking. In other words, if you empathize with people who need to consume the schedule as part of their work, you might make different choices on how it's written, right? How it's formatted, where it's stored, the importance of searchability, than if you're just looking at it from the perspective of recording the internal and external requirements of the retention of your organization's records. Okay, so to sort of start to wrap it up here, all the tools and the approaches I've gone through today should be thought of just as a toolkit, like I mentioned, right? So depending on what it is you're building, what you're working on, you can sort of hopefully pick and choose anything that you think is needed or useful. So, in the political, it's really about those power structures, whether you sort of pursue Cotter's model or not. Pay attention to all stakeholders. They all have a role, naysayers or proponents, and be able to leverage them against each other. Make sure you're able to gain your own, propel your own power by getting those allies. In the cultural, it's all just about honestly assessing what the culture is, whether you use the ICF or not, right? What are the things that we are confident we'll be able to change? What are the things we think we will not be able to change? And then also the psychological. So the importance and the benefits of sort of the motivation, right? How people get motivated to be able to jump in there and really take that into account. But that's sort of the prepared content today. I mentioned I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. I also put my email up there. If you do have any questions, if you want any of the resources I talked about, you want more information about them, you're more than welcome to reach out. But otherwise, do we have any questions that came in today?
Hi, this is Hutch. We did have that was a lot of information and a lot of strategizing. I mean, I'm going to try to place it. I mean, I'm definitely going to go over the recording more to get more out of it, to see how to really use it. Because I can, as you're going along, I think, wow, that's good for this, that's good for that. And I can see where, if I get some help from the people I work with, people above me, and also, my peers at my firm, we could really get some of this going. Where is the lowest hanging fruit in trying to apply these strategies, you think?
Yeah, so I'd say the lowest hanging fruit is probably that coalition building, right? Because that's really all about arming yourself. You haven't actually spent any resources other than your own time, right? You're really just understanding the lay of the land. It's like it assumes that you've already done work on the record schedule, so you understand the regulatory landscape, right? So you have some kind of foundation there, but understand who you're dealing with, both in terms of spotting obstacles that you might run into, and also where your alliances are, so that once you do move on to some of the other strategies, you can enlist their help and you can get a sort of a force multiplier for assessing some of the other ones. And everybody likes to talk, right? So it's all about listening, that alliance building. So don't ask anything of people. It's really about seeking out and having them to talk. So it's a very easy thing to engage with good ROI, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a huge plus. I work at a law firm that is somewhat democratic, I guess. They let each practice group do their own thing. And for me, it was helpful when I first started to go around to each practice group and say, you know, what records are you keeping? Who has access? Where, you know, where are they? Why do you think we have to keep them for the rest of forever? It was helpful to do that, but hearing this all again, I'm thinking, yeah, it's been 5 or 6 years. I should go make that effort again and try to get people on board. I have one practice group in particular who doesn't want to play at all. And as a law firm, I would think lawyers would be leery of that, but they're not.
Yeah.
Where do you think law firms fall in this, in getting this type of program off the ground and being able to apply these, you know, types of strategies? I mean, one thing about law firms is you're dealing with owners face to face very often, so that can be very good. You
But we're
know,
not regulated like financial
yes,
groups or pharmacy groups.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so the power dynamics at law firms are really interesting, right? Because it's almost like every single partner is their own mini business within the
yes.
business. So it's very feudal in that sense. And it has just not to speak ill of them, but attorneys just generally are technology adverse, right? It's changing a lot, but that's still very much so the case, especially with older ones. So you have that feudal power structure that's actually reaching into the information technology infrastructure as well, of like you've got a lot of sort of like rogue repositories that they're setting up for themselves. And so what I'd say is sort of like there's still a chair of the firm, right? They will still listen to top down leadership if it is strong. So I think that overall that approach still needs to be the same, where you're being able to say, okay, who can actually tell the most powerful partners what to do and why. But the last thing you want to do is do that without the groundwork and the intelligence. So unfortunately, it's a lot more of that alliance building because you simply have more stakeholders with power. You need to go all to all the different practice groups and sometimes partners within those practice groups. Not to say like, so what are you doing with your records? It's just like, what do you get out of the firm's information? Like, how do you conduct research? Like, what do you think about the email system? And sometimes it's like trying to get those online surveys that are really scalable. You don't have to like interview everybody in the entire firm to try and get some attitudes and behaviors and use that output to be able to bring it to who is in power, who is leadership, and with a very short amount of time, right? Really concise message being like, this is the reality of our culture around records. This is what this could lead to, right? These are the problems, and you would be on the hook for this, right? Your firm's reputation will be on the hook for this, to really use all that sort of information and intelligence to really make it succinct how potent these things are. Because if you try and do that messaging with every single partner, you'd convince them finally by the time you're ready to retire that like change needs to happen. But being able to use that information that you get to make it realistic, make it sort of immediate to the true leaders who are able to get people's ears. I think that's probably the best chance that you have for law firms. It's so feudal. I totally get it with law firms.
And you're saying feudal, not futile, right?
Yeah, exactly. Feudal,
Okay,
like the
excellent. All
feudal
right.
system, as opposed to like a federal or sort of like a centralized power.
If you don't want anything that's futile. Well, I think that's it for questions, and we're just right up on 11, and that was incredibly informative. That's a lot of information. I'm going to look at some of those resources that you links that you put up there, that you got your you know, some of the research from. That I think is really going to help. I mean, this kind of just gets me started in, you know, in the right direction. But I'd like to thank you very much. That was very gives you a lot to think about, but very useful.
Thank you
And
so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
not a problem.
Thank you.
And yeah, so tomorrow we start again at 10 o'clock. So for those signed up, please join us. And once again, Tom Preece from Rational.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.